She found the cowboy sleeping upright with a twin in each arm, too tired to breathe. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of golden grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Sarah stood in the doorway of their modest homestead, her hands still damp from washing the supper dishes, and felt the weight of another day pressing against her shoulders. The sun had dipped below the horizon an hour ago, painting the sky in shades of purple and amber, and still her husband had not come in from the fields. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, her boots making soft sounds against the weathered wood. The night air was cool against her face, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the darkness. She had married James 3 years ago, back when the world seemed full of promise and possibility. He had been a different man then, or perhaps she had simply seen him through different eyes. He had stood tall and proud at their wedding, his hands callous but gentle when they held hers, his eyes bright with dreams of the life they would build together. They had traveled west with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and a stubborn determination to carve out a piece of heaven from the untamed land. The first year had been hard, harder than either of them had imagined, but they had faced it together. The second year brought the twins, 2 perfect daughters who arrived on a stormy October night when the wind howled like a wounded animal and the rain beat against their roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Sarah crossed the yard toward the barn, her lantern casting dancing shadows across the ground. She could hear the gentle sounds of the horses in their stalls, the soft rustle of hay, and then she saw him. James sat slumped against the barn wall, still upright but clearly asleep, and in each of his arms was one of their daughters. Little Emma was tucked against his left side, her blonde curls spilling across his chest, while Lily nestled into his right shoulder, her tiny fist clutching the fabric of his shirt. Both girls were fast asleep, their faces peaceful and innocent, completely unaware of the exhaustion that had finally claimed their father. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene before her. James's hat had fallen to the ground beside him, and his head was tilted back against the rough wooden planks of the barn wall. His chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, and even in sleep, his face bore the marks of exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of too many days with too little rest. His arms were wrapped protectively around the twins, holding them secure even in his unconscious state, as if his body refused to release its vigilance even when his mind had surrendered to sleep. She set the lantern down carefully and knelt beside them, her heart aching with a mixture of love and worry. How long had he been out here like this? She had seen him after lunch, when he had taken the girls outside to give her a moment of peace to prepare the afternoon meal. That had been 6 hours ago. 6 hours of him working with the twins in his arms, unable to set them down because they were in one of their clingy phases, refusing to be apart from their father for even a moment. 6 hours of him trying to mend fences, feed the animals, check the water supply, and complete a dozen other tasks that couldn't wait, all while balancing 2 squirming toddlers who wanted nothing more than to be held. Sarah reached out and gently touched his face, and even through her fingertips she could feel the bone-deep weariness that had consumed him. His skin was cool to the touch, and when she pressed her fingers against the pulse point at his neck, she felt his heartbeat, steady but slow, like a clock winding down. She whispered his name, softly at first, then a bit louder, but he didn't stir. The twins shifted slightly in his arms, and Lily made a small sound in her sleep, but James remained motionless, locked in the grip of a sleep so profound that it bordered on unconsciousness. The past months had taken their toll on both of them, but especially on James. The drought that summer had forced him to dig a new well, spending weeks in the blazing sun with nothing but a shovel and his own determination. Then one of their horses had gone lame, and he had spent every spare moment trying to nurse it back to health while also managing the workload that usually required 2 healthy animals. The twins had fallen ill in August, a fever that had lasted nearly a week, and had both parents taking turns sitting up through the night, sponging cool water on fevered brows and praying to a God they hoped was listening. They had recovered, thank heaven, but the fear had left its mark on James, making him even more protective, even more reluctant to let them out of his sight. And then there was the money, or rather the lack of it. The crops hadn't brought in what they had hoped, and the winter supplies they needed to purchase were expensive. James had taken on extra work, helping neighbors with their harvests, repairing equipment for anyone who would pay, sometimes riding out before dawn and not returning until well after dark. Sarah had tried to help, taking in sewing and laundry from the women in the nearest town, but it was never quite enough. They were surviving, but just barely, and the strain of it showed in every line of James's face, every slow movement of his tired body. She stood up and walked back to the house, moving quickly now with purpose. She grabbed several quilts from their bed and returned to the barn. Carefully, so carefully, she began to extract Emma from James's left arm. The little girl stirred and whimpered, reaching instinctively for her father, but Sarah hushed her gently and pulled her close. Emma's eyes opened briefly, confused. Sarah tried once more to wake him, speaking his name more loudly this time, even shaking his shoulder gently, but he remained unresponsive. His breathing was so shallow that she had to watch carefully to see the rise and fall of his chest, and for a moment, panic seized her. What if this was more than exhaustion? What if something was truly wrong? She pressed her ear against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong despite everything, and felt relief wash over her. He was simply exhausted beyond the point where his body would respond to normal stimuli. He had pushed himself past his limits, and his body had finally rebelled by shutting down completely. She couldn't move him, not by herself. James was a tall man, broad-shouldered and solid, and even with all his weight loss from the months of hard work, he was far too heavy for her to lift. So she did the only thing she could do. She wrapped the quilt around him as best she could, tucking it around his shoulders and across his lap. She placed the pillow behind his head, cushioning it against the hard barn wall. She checked to make sure he was breathing freely, that nothing was obstructing his airways, and then she sat down beside him and took his hand in hers. In the quiet of the barn, with only the soft sounds of the animals and the distant call of night birds, Sarah allowed herself to cry. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but silent tears that slipped down her cheeks and dripped onto their joined hands. She cried for the dreams they had started with, dreams that seemed so much harder to reach now than they had 3 years ago. She cried for the burden James carried, the weight of being the provider, the protector, the one who had to be strong even when strength seemed impossible to find. She cried for herself, for the loneliness of those long days when he was working and she was managing the house and the children alone, for the conversations they used to have that had been replaced by exhausted silences and discussions of practical necessities. But most of all, she cried because she loved him, this stubborn, hard-working man who would literally work himself unconscious rather than let his family go without. She loved him for his dedication, even when that dedication scared her. She loved him for the way he held their daughters, with such tenderness and protectiveness, even when he could barely hold himself upright. She loved him for the sacrifices he made without complaint, for the dreams he still held onto even when reality tried to crush them, for the gentle way he touched her face on those rare moments when they had time to simply be together. Hours passed, and still James slept on. Sarah dozed occasionally, her head resting against his shoulder, but mostly she stayed awake and kept watch. She thought about their life, about the choices that had brought them to this place. They could have stayed back east, could have taken the safe route, working in factories or shops, living in cramped apartments in crowded cities. But they had wanted more than that. They had wanted land of their own, space to breathe, a place where their children could run free and grow strong. They had wanted to build something with their own hands, to create a legacy that would outlast them. And they were doing it, she realized as she sat there in the darkness. They were doing it despite every obstacle, every setback, every moment of doubt and fear. They had a home, modest but solid, that James had built with his own 2 hands. They had land, 40 acres that belonged to them free and clear. They had livestock and crops, enough to feed themselves and a little extra to sell. They had 2 beautiful, healthy daughters who were growing up knowing that they were loved and wanted and cherished. They had each other, and that, Sarah understood in that moment, was worth every hardship they had endured. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the barn walls, James finally stirred. His eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding his features as he tried to remember where he was and how he had gotten there. Sarah squeezed his hand, and he turned his head to look at her, his expression gradually clearing as awareness returned. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, what happened? Where are the girls?" Panic touched his face as he realized his arms were empty, and he tried to sit up straighter, his body protesting the movement. Sarah placed her hand against his chest, gently but firmly, keeping him still. "The girls are fine," she assured him. "They're inside, sleeping in their bed." You fell asleep out here with them in your arms. I couldn't wake you. James closed his eyes again, and she saw shame cross his features. I'm sorry, he said. I just meant to sit down for a minute. I was so tired, and they wouldn't let me put them down, and I thought if I just rested for a moment. Hush, Sarah interrupted him. You have nothing to apologize for. You've been working yourself to death, James. You can't keep going like this. I have to, he said simply. Who else is going to do it? We need you, Sarah said firmly. Alive and healthy. We need you to be able to breathe, James. What good are you to us if you work yourself into an early grave? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the weariness in his eyes that went beyond physical exhaustion. I'm just trying to give you and the girls a good life, he said softly. I'm trying to make sure we don't lose everything we've worked for. I know, Sarah replied, her voice gentle now. And I love you for it. But we're a family, James. We're supposed to carry these burdens together. You don't have to do it all alone. They sat there as the sun rose, talking in quiet voices about things they hadn't had time to discuss in months. They talked about asking for help, about swallowing their pride and accepting assistance from their neighbors when it was offered. They talked about slowing down, about learning to say no to extra work when James's body was already at its limit. They talked about finding small moments of joy amidst the hard work, about remembering why they had chosen this life in the first place. And when they finally stood up, stiff and sore from a night spent on the hard ground, they did it together, supporting each other as they made their way back to the house where their daughters were just beginning to wake.